Similarly, a second recommendation is that facilities housing DC prisoners, case management staff should be trained appropriately. This really cannot effectively happen unless they are in one small number of facilities. And third is to address the issue of juveniles. There's simply no reason for DC kids, 9, 10, 11 of them, to be sent to North Dakota to serve out their sentences. Thank you so much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fornesi. Mr. Cook, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I'd like to say good afternoon, and I'm also honored to be able to sit before y'all today, and I thank y'all for being, giving the floor so I can share my testimony today. Thank you.
Mr. Sawyer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of Congress and their staff, distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. You mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in introducing me where I was employed with the SUM program, and I need to clarify something, that it's not the SUM so others may eat. It's the Opportunities Industrialization Center of Washington, D.C. And I needed to note that for the record, because I don't believe I can go back to Southeast if I did not.
Okay, that's duly noted.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I do have a pamphlet for you for the members of Congress. All right. I wanted to thank you for this opportunity, for sharing with those members who are here in reference to the plight of D.C. prisoners far away from home. I do not want to be redundant for what Mr. Fornesi has said. He has covered most of everything in a nutshell. But I'd like to talk with have the opportunity to speak to the recidivism and the reentry of D.C. prisoners coming back into the nation's capital. And one thing I do note that is very serious are 5 essential basic needs that should be looked upon. And those are the transportation of a D.C. prisoner, a returning citizen coming back to the nation's capital, his medical care, psychological, what have you, clothing issues, employment, and housing. These are
all other federal offenders. 75% of the male Superior Court offenders are within 500 miles of home. 69% of all other male federal offenders are within 500 miles of home. For females, 81% are within 500 miles of home. For all other females in the federal system, 69% are within 500 miles of home. And this has been somewhat true over the course of many, many years. It's unfortunate that a long, long time ago we didn't see the value of inmates being closer to home, and before we built prisons, we built them in locations that were closer to where the inmates were coming from. Unfortunately, that did not happen. So today our infrastructure, much of it new, are in remote, rural locations where there are not as many inmates coming from those systems. But you can see that the distance issue has been a challenge for us for a long, long time. To compensate for that, we work closely with United States Probation Service, our contract providers in the halfway houses, SSOSA, and others, to try to improve the relationship in advance of the inmates returning home. To your question, before you can do any of the things you want to do in prison, provide programs, provide reentry opportunities, teach GED, teach vocational training, have inmates working in prison industries, you must run safe prisons. Inmates must be able to safely come out of their cells from 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, whatever time that is, and function within that unit. It's been our experience that we've been more successful allowing that to happen when we have a balanced designation process, when inmates are balanced both geographically, gang-wise, racially, and ethnically. And we strive to achieve that balance in our institutions and retain that balance. But as you indicated, it is even more of a challenge when you don't have enough beds, because quite honestly, there are some days you're just trying to find an empty bed to put an inmate in at the appropriate security level. So I don't think it's possible within 250 miles and successfully manage those prisons as safely as we do today, because it will disrupt this balance that we are trying to achieve. And that's unfortunate. The other thing is there are several reasons why those that are beyond 500 miles. One, medical care. Some inmates require more medical care. And let me just mention this very briefly. We classify inmates based on security level. Once that's accomplished, we classify them on care level. How much medical care do we think they're going to require based on their physical condition? Because we came to the realization a few years ago that we could not provide the same level of care, health care, at every facility, given the fact that many were built in very rural locations or in very urban locations where we were competing for limited resources in the way of healthcare providers, one, and two, that there were not a lot of facilities outside of that institution, hospitals, that could provide that care if, in fact, we could not provide the care inside the facility. So therefore, we created healthy institutions and then institutions with inmates who were healthy but needed some additional care, and then our more institutions with greater need for health care. That alone sends inmates a little further away from home so that we can provide adequate health care. Separations. There
Mr.
are
Lappin,
inmates
you
from
have,
the district
you
who-
have far exceeded, I only have 5 minutes for you. You've exhausted all that time. I appreciate your answer was no. Is that correct?
I do not
Do you-
believe that we can do it as safely as we do today.
Okay. All right. I will now yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to go swiftly because 5 minutes goes by fast. I do not understand why we have 102 people from Washington, D.C. in Arizona. I mean, understanding the documentation I'm seeing here, give me one reason why we would send somebody all the way to Arizona other than it's got really good weather.
High security sex offenders.
What about
It's the only housing unit of a high security nature where we can house sex offenders in an open population.
There's nowhere closer than
There is
in
nowhere
Arizona.
closer for high security sex offenders than Tucson, Arizona.
What about 101 people in Colorado?
As I indicated, inmates that have special security needs, there are 44 of them in ADX Florence because they have assaulted staff and inmates, they've killed inmates, they have attempted to escape. So there is a high security facility there, ADX Florence. There are 41 alone in that facility because of their misconduct in prison.
Let me go to Ms. Pardon, please help me pronounce your last name, Mr. Fernacey. At least from your kind of nonverbal, I thought you took some issue to this idea of balance based on medical needs and those types of things. Do you care to comment on that based on what Mr. Lynch was questioning?
Well, yes, thank you. I mean, I was just quickly looking at
Is your
the listing.
mic on? I want to make sure your mic's on.
Sorry, I keep messing that up.
It's hard. You got to keep it close. Yeah.
I was looking at the listing of where DC prisoners are, and there's some number of folks in medical facilities, which is the care level 4. The care level 3, there's a smaller number, but I'm not sure that actually states it. I think the security issues, I suspect, are stronger on Mr. Lappin's basis than are the medical issues. There are many medical facilities within this area. The care level system is actually relatively new. I guess what I was raising my eyebrows at, I'm a little bit, I'm not quite sure how to interpret it, was the notion of having certain kinds of balance, including racial balance. And that was what I was responding to. DC folks are known as about 95% African American prisoners. It's an urbanized population. The BOP generally is 38% African American.
Thank you. Mr. Cook and Mr. Sawyer, first of all, I appreciate you being here. You have been there. You have seen it. I think your only vested interest is probably to make it better. So maybe starting with Mr. Cook and then Mr. Sawyer, from your vantage point, what are the 2 or 3 things, and if you just have one, you just have one, but that you would like to see improved? It's just your own personal point of view. It's from what you've witnessed. If you could make the situation better, what should we be doing? What should we be insisting that the Bureau of Prisons do better?
Meaning far as you mean far as the
Coming
the
back into the
location?
system. Yeah.
Well, from my experience, I've been locked up 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And out of 8 years, I've been to 5 different penitentiaries. And out of 5 different penitentiaries, I say, well, with the help of Mr. Fernacey, I've been out in Indiana. I'm not no security risk. So I'm wondering why was I out there? I don't have no family out there. Then after I leave there, I go to Kentucky. Same thing apply. So I'm curious to know what do they, what is the information they use to place a person? I'm just thinking they go and sending you to the next next bid.
Now, he talked about the safety and security of these prisons. From the time they open that cell to the time they close it, did you feel safe in those penitentiaries?
Well, I'm going to say the only thing I was kind of worried about was getting back home, closer to home. Other stuff don't even matter to me.
How did you communicate? Do you have family here then?
Yes.
How did you communicate with them? Are there any resources or any?
Well, being so far away, your money, you don't really have too much money.
Right.
And when you get a job in there, they pay you little less than nothing. So the little money you do obtain, you gotta stretch it. Either you gonna
Like, give me an idea. What were you doing and how much money were you making?
Well, my first job, I've been a tutor, throughout the BOP. That pay a little bit. That's one of the.
Like,
'cause
how
I'm
much in a
helping-
month? How much in a month does that make?
An hour?
Yeah.
Like 30-something cents an hour.
30 cents an hour. And with that, you're expected to pay for long-distance toll calls and all that kind of thing to communicate with your
much.
family?
Pretty
Was your family ever able to come out and visit you?
No good.
If you'd like to have the question, the same question.
Yeah, Mr. Sawyer, I'll give you an opportunity. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you so much. Your question again, sir?
What are if you had two or three, maybe one or two things that you just want the Bureau of Prisons to do to improve the system for people that are so far away, what would that be? What it would be very specific and as brief as you can on what you'd like them to do.
Well, I'm very much concerned about Mr. Lampkin, who spoke to the issue about when the individuals come out of their prison cells. And I've been in for 25 years, and I've yet to see, because I've been in the medium security facility, and even at the United States Penitentiary in Lee County, when you understand that we are in a prison setting, and when you fear no one but God and God alone, then that tends to give you a more secure balance in where you are and who you are. But of course, we understand it is a prison, and it's a United States Penitentiary, and it's prison. But still, for the Bureau of Prisons to look at it and bringing the District of Columbia inmates closer, states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, it should be looked upon as a serious entity wherein the closeness, I don't believe we are a security factor. For those who went in 25, 30 years ago who are now coming home, they are looking forward to being with their families. It's a telephone issue, it's a visitation issue, and it's very expensive. They travel all night to get to the facility, and when they come, they're not welcome because for whatever reason, the Federal Bureau of Prison staff are not too liking to DC prisoners and their families. And to be honest with you, and I'll share that with you because no one wants to speak about that. But that's an issue. That's an issue.
Thank you both. I wish you nothing but the best, and I appreciate your taking time to be here. Thanks for the latitude and time, Madam Chair. And I think it's just a crying shame that these people have to be so far away. They're dealing with an exceptionally difficult situation, to say the very least, for them and their families. And there's something we got to do because this ain't right.
I thank you very much, Ms. Chavis, for your questions, and because I think they have elicited the dilemma that we have before us, and I'm going to say a dilemma that I think is quite solvable. As you probe the witnesses who've been transferred from one prison to another, and for that matter, Mr. Lappin, I want to thank the Bureau of Prisons for quickly admitting D.C. residents to the state-of-the-art drug program. We recognize there are always backlogs, but the notion that our prisoners were not even admitted, That was not your fault, but you certainly got that done. You've set up a drug program, state-of-the-art program also at Rivers. We are very grateful for that. The answers to the questions posed by the chairman and the ranking member, of course, have elicited from Mr. Lappin, you know, what you'd expect. He's talking about the federal prison system as it is, as if Congress in the Revitalization Act hadn't given him a new charge. They didn't say, here's a federal prison, see what you can do with these state prisoners. The charge was to do something unprecedented, take state prisoners and deal with them as state prisoners within a federal prison system. And you know that was the case because they are not the D.C. code still. They are recognizable D.C. Prisoners. So we're working with 500 miles. You've heard testimony here, I think it's from Ms. Levine, you know, 100 miles is what you find in the average state. Already they are at a severe disadvantage, and we in the district are supposed to say, welcome home, friends. At the end of, it could be 25 years, it could be 10 years, it could be a few years. No matter what it is, almost none of them have access to family or services. So we're not asking for a change in the federal system. We're asking for the federal system to do what the Revitalization Act said. Take these state prisoners, treat them as state prisoners within a federal system. Do not disadvantage them. Give them the advantages that come from your system, not disadvantages imposed on them. Now, the fact is, Mr. Lappin, we have some reason to believe that your office may already be thinking in these terms. Has your office been in touch with the D.C. Department of Corrections about bringing D.C. code offenders home early, 90 days, and putting them in the D.C. Correctional Treatment Facility here in the District of Columbia?
Yes, we have had a discussion over the phone.
With whom have those discussions taken place?
Director Brown.
Is Director Brown here? Rather than deal in hearsay, could I ask that Mr. Brown take the table? I don't want you to have to quote Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, would somebody, staff, bring a chair up so that Mr. Brown can take his seat here? Since he is here, this is somebody close to home who has already had discussions. This is a problem-solving hearing, and we want to solve this problem beginning now. Now, we have testified. Could you please stand and be sworn? Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Now, you have testified in your written testimony on page 5 to the advantages. You're right, we tried to get closer to home. We even tried to reserve some part of the Lorton facility for this very purpose. You talk about the advantages that for the D.C. Superior Court and closeness to Sosa. You spell that out, I think, very well. You say you have had discussions with Director Devon Brown of the D.C. Department of Corrections. Would you, Mr. Brown, say firsthand what those discussions have concerned?
Yes, Director Lappin is correct. I contacted him approximately 3 weeks ago to discuss several proposals, all impacting upon D.C. inmates. One of those proposals entailed having D.C. inmates who are in his custody 90 days from their release be placed in one of my facilities, whereby we could provide them, that is the city and C. Sosa, wraparound services to help in their transition back into our community.
Now, you are willing to take these prisoners. See, Mr. Lappin, I want you to consider that when we hear testimony here, we understand the constraints of the federal prison system. But I need to ask you whether you are prepared to accept this offer of the D.C. Department of Corrections with the director here testifying today.
I'm not willing to accept that as of yet. we're going to meet because I think there's another group that needs to be discussed in advance of that.
Another group of what?
DC offenders who are serving short sentences. Because of the crowdedness at the jail previously, we've been designating inmates who are serving over 30 days to a federal prison. And I shared with the director that we should first look at this group, because in most jurisdictions, when individuals are serving 6 months or less, we oftentimes designate them to the jail in lieu of transferring them to federal prison, because when we do that, by the time they get to the federal prison, it's time to return to their home.
Well, Director Brown, did you take this notion, which is not new to the subcommittee, into consideration? This notion about people who, people who violated parole?
Actually, they're serving a sentence of 6 months or less.
But they are felons.
They are felons.
Yes, ma'am. The discussion really began over weekenders, which is very similar. I could not see, nor could the federal judges here see, the utility of having someone who has been sentenced to several weekends have their lives disrupted by having to travel to one of the federal penitentiaries.
So what happens now to the weekenders or these short-termers?
We've had very few of them, but when we do have them, we try to find a jail in close proximity to house them. So out of Baltimore, there's a jail about 2 hours away. We're in agreement with the director on that issue and the other issue. The one I'm hesitating on is returning these longer-term offenders 90 days before they release back to the district until we have a chance to look at how many that would be, so that he doesn't accept more than he can actually handle at the jail, how much it will cost to transfer them from the federal prison back to the jail, and then to house them at the jail.
We know this, that you're paying to keep them in the federal prisons right now. We know that you testify at length about how overcrowded your prisons are. We know he has available beds, and the challenge is not, of course, to tell us what can't be done, but to adopt the same problem-solving attitude that we're trying to adopt in this hearing. If there is such an outstanding offer, this is what I ask. For you and Director Brown, within 30 days, to report on progress for the weekenders. You can throw anybody in there you want to, Mr. Lappin, but also for prisoners who would be returning to D.C., not excluding them, but including them, considering that there are a number of beds. It will be very hard, Mr. Lappin, for you to show me, since you got to pay for these people to come back home anyway, you have got to house them anyway. It will be very hard for you to show me, in your overcrowded condition, as you have testified here today, that you have a greater burden by keeping these prisoners in 115 prisons across the United States than accepting Mr. Brown's offer. I'm going to pass to, who's next, please? Mr. Davis was the next to arrive, and I'm very pleased that Mr. Davis is attending this hearing because he is the author of a landmark bill on reentry for inmates throughout the United States. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and let me thank the witnesses for being here. Director Lappin, it's good to see you again. You indicated that sex offenders under your care, you had to take them 500 miles away or to Arizona to find a Bureau of Prison facility where they could be housed? Or so you have
Not all sex offenders, high security sex offenders.
high security sex offenders. What about sex offenders who are not necessarily as high security?
After the passage of the Adam Walsh Act, the Congress and the new law required us to create 6 sex offender management programs. We have done that. There is one in Petersburg, Virginia. There is one in Marianna, Florida. There's one in each of our regions. The closest one for high security sex offenders is Tucson. You can't imagine how difficult it is to house high-security sex offenders in an open population. Prior to this, many of them were housed in segregation because they were unwilling to go to the compound. So we had to find a location where we could introduce this with an entirely new group of inmates, and that was to do it at a brand-new facility. The only high-security institution opening during that time was the one in Tucson. That's where we chose to place this high-security sex offender program.
Let me ask, what happens to these individuals once they have completed their sentences? Once they've served their time, and it's time for them to return back home?
Are you asking me?
Well, no,
That would be, they would be under CSOSA supervision. We develop a plan for each individual depending on risk and needs. The sex offenders are housed and are supervised in a specialized unit under CSOSA. And those units are at 300 Indiana Avenue. And we have programs in place to supervise them accordingly. They're lower caseloads. We institute GPS if necessary. We place them in therapeutic groups. And the caseload ratio, as I indicated, is much smaller in dealing with that population. The jobs are looked at a little differently because we have to make sure that where they're working are conducive and they not pose a risk. And their housing needs are also scrutinized if, in fact, they have separations against children, then we do not place them in homes or jobs where children are present.
and I ask these questions basically because it's my experiences that sex offenders basically give up their freedom once they are convicted of a sex crime. I mean, my experiences are that trying to find a place for sex offenders to live is almost impossible because obviously there's no community, there is no location, there is no place where they are pretty much acceptable to the rest of society. And I raise that point because I often talk to young people and I actually caution them quite a bit that, you know, if you reach the point, for all practical purposes, you're sentencing yourself to a lifetime of prison or a lack of freedom relative to movement. The other point I'd like to make, Madam Chairman, Mr. Cook, are you employed? Do you have a job?
No, I don't.
Have you tried to find a job?
Several times.
And you've been unsuccessful? You would attribute that to what?
I would contribute that to the lapse when I fill out my resume, the lapse in times of my current job to my, you know, the last job I had to now. And the resources.
Would you be a good worker?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Are you going to do another round?
We'll do another round, yes,
Sure.
sir. Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Lappin, help me with this. In your testimony, you say that the Bureau of Prisons has established employment resource centers at all federal prisons to assist inmates with job searches and other areas. Are those resources focused on local and statewide level? How do you do that?
They're really national, given the fact that in that institution you have inmates not only from all over the United States,
Right.
you've got inmates from all over the world.
Okay.
And so we focus on those U.S. citizens who are returning to this country with a national approach to how you go about finding a job.
And
Resume building,
Go ahead.
job searches. We actually are working with companies that provide software as to what jobs are vacant in certain areas that inmates can actually access and see what jobs are vacant in a given area, what types of jobs are available in a given area. So there are resources made available to them based on their release to assist them in preparing for a job search. And then as they transition to a halfway house or residential reentry center, we have workforce development staff.
You can do that if you only think in those terms. You have shown that you're willing to think otherwise in the answers when Mr. Brown sat down and you disclosed and he disclosed the conversations you're already having. I will have less frustration at this hearing if we begin to think in those terms, because as long as you thrust before us what you have, you are not showing the problem-solving notions that we think hearings are for. Hearings are to solve problems. We don't bring you here to say, gotcha. I think your prison system is an extraordinary prison system. I just don't think that if you continue to treat our folks as if they were like federal prisons, you are doing the best you are capable of doing for them. Well, here comes Sosas. They say, okay, let's try video mentoring. Well, first of all, how many prisons have you done video mentoring in BOP facilities?
We're doing it. I'm sorry, we're doing it at Rivers Correctional Facility, and we're getting ready to extend it to Hazleton.
Let me ask Mr. Lappin, and I don't expect you, I know you're talking about facilities all over the country, but suppose Sosa was able to do video mentoring with prisons outside of this one that is at least 4 hours from the district. I'm going to tell you, going 4 hours coming and 4 hours back. I don't know why anybody from D.C. ever gets to Rivers, much less to other prisons. But would there be anything to keep video mentoring from occurring in other federal prisons where there are D.C. inmates?
More than willing to look at new technology that would facilitate the visits.
Thank you very much. That's all I need to know if you're willing to look at it. And Miss Levine, in the states, in your experience, are rehabilitation and reentry services provided more or less for the duration of the prisoner's incarceration?
It varies quite a bit by state and even by facility within each state. So it's hard to make a blanket statement.
Well, if I'm in the state of Maryland.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to share with you, even before I knew what the conversation that Director Brown had with Mr. Lappin, I was sitting here thinking, a compromise might be to do what the state of Maryland does, which is something like between 6 and 12 months of a person's release date. People are transferred to the Maryland Pre-Release Center in Baltimore to be closer to their homes and jobs and services in the community. So there's a really good example out there of a way in which this could work. And
something like what Mr. Brown was speaking about when he testified, along with the conversation with Mr. Lappin.
So there are examples of that out there.
Mr. Brown?
The state of Maryland has been doing that for at least 10 years. I was involved in it, as the congressman indicated. I know it works. The way the model works is very similar to what I'm proposing, and that is individuals from Baltimore, who are placed throughout the Maryland system. When they're about 120 days out from their release, they are transitioned, and that's what is called a transition center, back to Baltimore, their home. That's where they reside, to receive wraparound services from parole and probation, from the community, from the churches, the very model that I'm asking, and I'm very pleased. I want to make it clear that Director Lappin has been open in his discussions with me. He has indicated quite correctly, as any director would, that we have to talk in terms of logistics. Just what would this involve? And we're at the early stages of the discussion. He is not rejected in any sense, being willing to explore.
We're here only testing feasibility, and very much appreciate your reference to Maryland. After discussing this innovation, Ms. Protiet, you say you suspended video mentoring in 2007, that the demand for mentors, because you were doing community-based mentoring, and then you say that substantially increased demand for mentors and quickly exhausted the available pool. You're now going back to video mentoring?
Yes, we had about 200 and some mentor and mentee matches, about 85 institutions. Well, you know, after a while, the mentor pool exhausts itself. And so the Community Justice Program, in fact, Jasper Ormond, who is here, is constantly continuing trying to recruit more mentors and institutions so that we'll have more to engage in this process.
Well, it does seem to me, with the discussions that Mr. Brown is having with Mr. Lappin, what Ms. Levine says about what happens in Maryland, which sounds like it's old hat. It sounds like state-of-the-art penology where it is possible. It's not possible for Mr. Lappin to do this within the system if the system doesn't accommodate to the needs of this state population. But if we begin to think more broadly and more flexibly, it does look like there are things we can do even now, even with no new prison or any close prison to the District of Columbia. Mr. Fornesy, very disturbing in your testimony was something that the Revitalization Act created that is a dead letter, it would seem. The Corrections Information Council, it was supposed to be a 3-member voluntary body. I have no idea what voluntary body refers to provide the BOP with advice and information regarding matters affecting the District of Columbia sentenced felon population. Then you say on page 3 that the CIC, this Corrections Information Council, has never visited any BOP facility to examine conditions or to interview DC prisoners. And here is the operative part, in part because there has never been a memorandum of understanding with BOP. You say the district government has failed also to appoint any members of the CIC since 2004, which means they at least had some members before, with last terms expiring in 2006. Shame on us. But first, let me understand about the so-called memorandum of understanding with BOP.
There had been negotiations, as my understanding is a little bit before my experience with the CIC. They had negotiations with the Bureau of Prisons, and there had been discussions, but no agreement was actually reached.
Well, let's ask Mr. Lappin, because he's the man in charge here at the BOP. What would be the difficulty in getting a memorandum of understanding so that these people could assist you in matters affecting the District of Columbia?
I'm more than happy to sit down with whoever's appointed and finish, because I have, in fact, here a draft memorandum from 2004. And so when there's a
You're ready to go with the district?
Absolutely. When we
Thank
have
you very
appointed
much.
candidates, we'll sit down with them and try to finish the memorandum and get it in place.
Thank you very much. It does look like the onus is on the District of Columbia. Is anybody here from the District of Columbia? You see the disconnect between the District of Columbia. Should at least have been somebody here from the District of Columbia. Now, we didn't notify the District of Columbia, but one of the things we've got to do is to reconnect to the District of Columbia. You can see why the disconnect would occur. The District of Columbia said, take this package off of us. We can't pay for it. The district had good reason to do that. It was carrying a state function that no city in the United States carries, state prisons. And of course, it wasn't funding them. The last thing to get funded was Lawton. Well, when you go to a federal, to become essentially a part of a federal agency, unless somebody is trying very hard in the District of Columbia, you say, well, you know, that's off my plate now. So one of our missions, along with yours, is to reconnect the District of Columbia, because I have every reason to believe the District of Columbia wants to be reconnected. So we're going to take that on as well, Mr. Lappin, and I appreciate your testimony in that regard. It's important to clarify, Mr. Fornesy, what you said about another part of your testimony. very disturbing to hear that 2008, 1,700 people were sent to BOP on parole revocations, overwhelmingly technical or administrative in nature, no new criminal behavior. No wonder you're overcrowded, Mr. Lappin. Now, we're working with the parole board. Mr. Fornesty, what do you think could be done about these people technically being sent away on technical and administrative violations? Is this a problem coming from their reentry, or is there a change in regulations or law required here?
Well, I think there's a couple issues. One is, which is also noted
Speak
in my
a little
I'm
closer.
sorry, I keep missing that. One of the problems is the law does not permit the District of Columbia to change its own parole laws at this point. It's not permitted to make any changes in its laws regarding parole without the consent of the United States
Well,
Attorney
that,
General.
Mr. Fornesty, I can understand your frustration, but you have here overlapping jurisdiction. Here, the parole board is a federal board.
Yes,
And one of the things we have to accommodate here, this is Mr. Lappin's challenge too, you can't say take these people into federal custody and not treat them in any way as if they are within a federal agency.
Certainly, and I certainly understand that. My point really is that, for instance, if the District of Columbia Council decided that technical violations, that is, positive urine sample for marijuana, or missing appointments with a parole officer, should not result in incarceration, but instead some other alternative.
Well, the district government wouldn't have to decide that. Couldn't the parole board decide that?
But that would be a non-district agency, and that has not been the parole board, the U.S. Parole Commission's inclination to do that. And that's one reason why we
Well,
have
the
some-
U.S. Parole Commission, I beg to differ, has a new chairman, a former police chief of the District of Columbia, who has, in fact, begun, even before he was named chairman of the board by President Obama, when he was a member of the commission, has in fact begun to use methods other than putting someone right back in prison for a technical violation. Ms. Prodiat, are you aware of some of what man I still call Chief Fullwood is doing at the U.S. Parole Board?
Yes, and I'd like to speak to Mr. Fornesty's remarks, just so that he'll know. In a testimony prior to this, we talked about a new venture that Court Services has taken on, and that is dealing with our technical violators who have substance abuse and new criminal charges that are minor, Category 1 or Category 2. And we have placed them in the correctional treatment facility for 180 days, and they do not face revocation. If they complete the program, they are returned to the community. It is only in a pilot stage. It's only 32 beds that hopefully we plan to expand to 96 beds. And this is also in collaboration with the United States Parole Commission, the Public Defender Service, the Bureau of Prisons, and D.C. Department of Corrections. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that we are still working on the sanctions matrix to identify and make sure that all of us, including the courts, are in agreement with the sanctions to make sure all of them have been applied before we ask for revocation for the D.C. prisoners.
This, of course, is not what Ms. Prodiat is saying. Some of it's pilot. It's not all well known, but it does show the kind of innovation that is going to take if we are going to have state prisoners in this federal system. And the reason I don't want to go to the city council and then go to is because I think most of what we're discussing here today can be done with administrative innovation without changes in law and getting all bollocksed up and who has jurisdiction and whatever. Look, D.C. has said, y'all got jurisdiction. We don't want to pay for these prisoners. Whenever I've asked the DC Council to do anything, as I did, Mr. Lappin will remember, as we had to do with the state-of-the-art drug program, the problem was on the DC side. DC did it instantly. This is an administrative problem. Mr. Lappin has shown extraordinary ability to deal administratively with the problems we brought to his attention, and the testimony here has been very encouraging. Mr. Fanasi, you talk about the release of prisoners from the Selman case.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you elaborate on what that means for reentry and what the Selman case, Selman versus Riley, means for the Bureau of Prisons and for the District of Columbia?
Certainly. The Selman versus Riley was decided in 2008, where the district court found that the U.S. Parole Commission was using the wrong standards in determining who should be paroled. So that was changed, and as a result, throughout 2009 and early 2010, the U.S. Parole Commission, through extreme pressure, has agreed to a lot of remedial hearings for people to release them. And this is approximately 600 to 700 extra hearings were held in about a 3 or 4 month span, the end of 2009, early 2010. So, and that was in fact that Mr. Sawyer was released. These folks have all been held at least 12 years and as many as 25 years, the folks affected by the Selman decision. So they're all long-term prisoners. And what the impact is now happening now, it's about a 50% or so increase in releases for about 6 to 8 months this year and tapering off. There will still be more in the future affected by this decision, but the large
And so these
number
people
are
are
this
coming
year.
straight out as a result of these hearings? Are these
Yeah,
coming
well,
out?
through the normal process. They're going through the halfway houses or...
Yes, but they will come out from wherever they happen to be
Yes.
located.
And it's important to realize also that the regulations under which they're being released, they've been found to evidence of rehabilitation. They're disciplinary problem. They have no disciplinary issues. They've done programming. So they've been ruled by the commission to be a safe release. So they're not representing a danger of any kind.
Because if they're not a safe release, then they're not released under this program, under Selman.
Yes.
Yes, Ms. Prodier.
We did a profile for all of the cases, so we wanted to be proactive in that and working with the Bureau of Prisons, so we'll know who exactly is coming out. And if you'd like, I can just give you a quick overview of what we have.
Please.
The average age for this population is 43. 10% of them are age 56 or older. The youngest person is 30 years of age. 56% of them will have less than a high school diploma or GED. 73% of them are unemployed. 50% have very limited employment opportunities. 30% are in need of stable housing. 83% of them have a history of some type of violence. 38% have a history of property crimes. 34% have a history of drug-related crimes, and 24% have a history of weapon offenses. And then 66% have a history of illicit drug usage, mostly marijuana, cocaine, and PCP. 34% have a history of alcohol use, and 9% have a need for behavioral health services. 60% report having children, and 9 or 10 of them are dependent children. 12% of them reported children live in the same household. So we wanted to get some kind of profile to see what we needed, to services we needed to provide for them once they are released.
Very useful. You see what we're talking about? We're talking about older prisoners, not particularly prepared to get out, thought they were going to be in longer. BOP had every reason to think they would be in longer. They're going to come home with very little preparation. And of course, your profile points up what Mr. Lappin has absorbed. These are local street criminals. These do not fit the profile of your average federal prisoner. Yes, there are some street criminals in federal prison, but these fit much more the profile of Los Angeles State Prison, Maryland State Prison, New York State Prison, than they do your average federal prison. And when these prisoners are mixed in with other prisoners, there have been reports that that there have been disturbances and problems, have there not, Mr. Lappin, of placing these prisoners of this profile? You heard 80-some% have weapons offenses. I mean, these are not folks just toting some drugs, Mr. Lappin. These are honest-to-goodness folks who got in some big trouble in the District of Columbia. You just mix them in with folks in federal prisons of various types, and you sometimes have had problems with that in your prison, with the result that you transfer out folks all around the country. Isn't that so?
It is to some degree, although over the last 20 years, we have acquired a much more violent offender of our own with the passage of the federal drug laws, the firearms violations. The classification system should put them in prisons with like inmates. So again, it is true that we've had some disturbances, some problems. I can't say it's unique just to the DC inmates. We have other groups that have been problematic, whether they're Caucasian groups or Hispanic groups alike. So it's a combination.
Yeah. I understand, sir. I understand. I can tell you this. I think that the Bureau of Prisons, given its long history and its effective history, I might add, in this country, if we challenge the Bureau of Prisons to house DC inmates in a prison, to segregate them accordingly, and to deal with them as a state prison system within the federal system, given your long record of success in state-of-the-art penology, whether you think you could do it, I think your record speaks for itself and that it could be done. Now, I want to put on the record who these two men are who have agreed to come and testify, because we didn't just want them to testify third hand. They have experience that needs to be on the record. Let's start with Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook, you live in the district. How old are you?
39.
When were you released from what prison? What prison were you released from to come home?
Cumberland, Maryland.
From Cumberland, in Cumberland, Maryland.
Yes.
How many years have you spent in prison?
8.
8 of your 39 years. Who do you live with in the District of Columbia?
My sister.
You are very fortunate that you have a relative. What was your last job? What kind of work were you doing? You remember?
Yeah, it was. I was working at the time it was called the MCI Center.
What were you doing?
It was janitorial work.
You have any children?
Yes.
How many prisons have you been in the Bureau of Prisons?
5.
5 prisons. Out of, and what? How many in a term of how many years, Mr. Cook? How many years were you in the Bureau of Prisons?
8.
So 5 prisons in 8 years. What was your first contact with your family? Was it when you were home for the first time, or did you have some kind? I'm talking about physical contact with somebody coming to see you. Does people come to Cumberland to see you?
Yeah.
Were they more likely to come to Cumberland than when you were at the other 4 places you were?
Yes.
Did that help your reentry? Did it help you to get used to being home and to prepare to come home? To see someone, to have some contact with family?
Nah.
Why not?
Because what drove me is I wanted to be home myself. But it was a plus to have them to come down there. But after a while, you start looking at things. We much older, so they can only do but so much. Everything else falls on us.
Do you receive services, Mr. Cook? Now that you're home from court services, the SISOSA, or from the District of Columbia, or any services at all?
No. Far as you mean, far as my supervision or something?
No, anybody helping, any services to help you find a job? Do the people who render supervision help you in any way?
Well, they put me in programs, as far as, you know, outreach programs and stuff, but most times I do it myself.
Mr. Cook, what were you sent to prison for? What was the offense?
Robbery.
Mr. Sawyer,
Yes, ma'am.
what was the offense for which you did time, and how much time did you do?
Murder 1, 25 years, ma'am.
How many prisons were you, in your 25 years, how many prisons of the BOP were you? Were you in Lawton first?
Yes, ma'am.
Once you were transferred from Lawton to the Bureau of Prisons, how many Bureau of Prisons were you in?
2.
And what were they?
In 2002, United States Penitentiary in Lee County, Jonesville, Virginia, and in November of 2007, the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood in White Deer, Pennsylvania.
Are you now at Hope Village?
Yes, ma'am.
This is a halfway house
That is correct.
of the Bureau of Prisons.
Yes, ma'am.
How old are you, Mr. Sawyer?
49, ma'am.
Now, you are one of the so-called Selman cases that Mr. Fornesy testified about.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you expect to be released when you were? In other words, along comes this district court decision. Who informed you that you might be subject to release?
Well, madam, this was my rehearing. In December of 2005, I went up for my initial, and at that time, I was given a 36-month set-off. And December of 08 was my rehearing, and it didn't occur until April of 09.
Well, you had to have 2 hearings.
Yes, ma'am.
Why were 2 hearings necessary, Mr. Sawyer?
For the first one was denied parole because of the ceiling factor.
Because of the what?
Ceiling factor. The ceiling factor in which the number of months that I had not served based on the United States Parole Commission's guidelines versus the D.C. Parole Board's guidelines.
But upon rehearing,
yes, ma'am,
it was decided that you were eligible for release?
That is correct.
How much sooner were you released than you expected?
Well, I had initiated the thought of going home in my first hearing, but because of the...
No, I'm sorry, before the Selman case, were you sentenced to 25 years? Is that
No, I was sentenced to 22 years, 4 months to life.
22 years, 4 months to life?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so you did not expect, whether the first hearing or the second hearing, to be out of prison when you were released, is that right?
Oh, no, ma'am, I expected it.
You did expect it?
Yes, ma'am, most definitely.
Why did you expect it?
Well,
the Selman case came along, making it possible for you to come out earlier than might otherwise have occurred. Is that not true?
Well, madam, according to what I was asked to do, and to program to stay disciplinary free, and in my 25 years, I have done just that. And based on the first hearing, all that was in place, recommendations and persons who spoke on my behalf, it was expected that parole would be granted. But it
based on your good conduct, the way you
Yes, ma'am.
conducted yourself as a man in that prison.
That is correct.
Sir,
ma'am,
did you have contact with your family at any time when you were at Bureau of Prison Facilities?
Yes, ma'am. I had family visits, not often, but at the United States Penitentiary in Lee County, for it took them 13 to 14 hours to come from the nation's capital to Jonesville, Virginia, and they would travel overnight on a bus excursion where one of the gentlemen in our prisons would run a bus service once or twice, maybe 4 times a year, and they would run a bus and they would stay overnight, leave that Friday night, stay all day Saturday, go to the hotel, come back on Sunday, spend time with the gentlemen who were in prison, and then travel back to the nation's capital on Sunday night. and
Have
return.
mercy. Who was kind enough to conduct that bus service? Was it you, Mr. Lappin? Was it the Sosa?
No, it's not us.
No, ma'am.
I don't, do you
This
know,
was a private entity.
that was doing this in
Yes.
order to enable these families?
Yes.
Of course, and they have to pay to go on this?
Yes,
Somebody
no-
had to pay
no-
for it.
No more than $45 to $50.
No more than $45 to $50 and 13 or 14 hours to see a loved one. There were some loving members of that family. who,
Yes, ma'am.
You were fortunate indeed given that kind of long trip. When I went to Rivers, I was 4 hours each way. I thought I would kill myself before I got back. Riding along those roads in a van that I very much appreciate that the Bureau of Prisons provided it. But the distance made me wonder for the parents, no matter how, or relatives, no matter how it was facilitated for them to get there. It's an exhausting trip to
Yes,
come
ma'am.
so far.
Yes, ma'am.
Now you have services provided by such as are available, of course, at Hope. I'm sorry, I have a thank you. I have one of these allergy outbreaks you're reading about everywhere, or perhaps experiencing. Was there any preparation provided, any services provided to prepare you to come home during the months before you were released?
No more than I secured for myself.
Meaning?
The letters that I've written to organizations here, faith-based, reentry, those type of letters to those organizations, and having those persons write back.
But nothing like you've heard testify that Mr. Brown did when he served in the state of Maryland and the prisoners were brought from Maryland, brought to Baltimore for reentry for several months before they came home. Nothing like that was done for you.
No, ma'am, and it would be welcome if it would have been.
Nor did you have access to the court services, SOSA as we call it, at all in any way?
Only with the letter writing campaign, and I did write to the faith-based mentoring initiative, and Mrs. Christine Kills returned my letter, and we had dialogue once or twice by letter. And when I returned home, I did contact her, and she and I have been in contact ever since.
Mr. Cook and Mr. Sawyer, you are both very motivated men, and we find that when people arrive, their motivation is at a very high level. And if it's at a high level when they arrive in D.C., we cannot imagine how much good would be done if we had something like what Mr. Brown is talking about, so that a few months beforehand, instead of slapping you right back in the midst of your hometown, you had some preparation. Your testimony has been invaluable. It is helped, I think, Mr. Lappin learn more about what happens. After all, he has responsibility for many thousands more who have nothing to do with the District of Columbia, and we're putting a very special burden on him. To have Mr. Brown fortuitously here, we're so pleased, Mr. Brown, that although you were not invited to this hearing because it was about federal matters, that you were interested enough to come, because it turns out that you have helped us in in some considerable ways to move forward so that this hearing is not just about talk, but about accomplishing something. The testimony of each of you has been invaluable. By almost inevitably, the official witnesses get most of the questions because they are the people who are responsible, but all of you have offered testimony that has been indispensable to our understanding of what is possible and how to make this system work within the confines that Mr. Lappin must address. I repeat, we're not seeking release from the federal prison system. We have great respect for the federal prison system. Even in my opening testimony where I talked about what the federal prison system isn't preparing, the vocational programs, which I happen to have seen and appreciate, they are all state-of-the-art programs. You have to understand what BOP does. It doesn't just smack a program down. It then tests it and retests it. It keeps valuable statistics. These people know what they're doing. Yes, they couldn't possibly have a vocational program in there to match the District of Columbia. What are our industries? Tourism, hospitals, the Verizon kinds of job that Mr. Cook had. We can't expect Mr. Lappin to reorient vocation in the prison system, but what we can do is bring the district to Mr. Lappin. We don't want to revolutionize his system. We want to work within his system, but we want to work within his system as a state system that must, in fact, report ultimately to the District of Columbia, its residents and its officials who will be responsible if these two men, extremely motivated, do not have the preparation necessary for them to come home and do what they clearly want to do now, which is to live law-abiding lives. This subcommittee, and I can assure you that this chairman who has been taking great leadership on law enforcement issues since he's chaired this committee, I can assure you, you will have the greatest cooperation from this subcommittee and the full committee if we, in fact, do what the committee believes must be done. Adapt, be flexible, accommodate us, facilitate us within that system for the greater good of our inmates and their families, and especially the greater good of the residents of the District of Columbia. This has been a very fruitful, a very useful hearing to this subcommittee. Mr. Lappin and Mr. Brown, you are to report on your progress on your discussions. We don't expect everything to be wrapped up in a neat package, Mr. Lappin, but your progress within 30 days to the chairman of this committee. Please feel free to have discussions as well with Ms. Potiet and Sisosa and others who have served on this panel. The subcommittee cannot thank you enough for your indispensable and invaluable testimony. This hearing